Okay, so now we're doing another demo. This one will be the ornament or tchotchke tray. I've prepared a couple of things for you to see. This is an example of a pretty intricate little tchotchke tray. All you need to do to turn this into an ornament is to put a hole right in here, and you can only do that when it's wet. This right now is dry, it's greenware. It hasn't been fired yet. This is using the electric brown clay, this one. And then I painted on top with some white clay slip. And then once it was dried a little bit, but not dry, like scratchy dry, but like slightly bendy dry, I took a needle tool, but a duller needle tool like, let me show you, this little guy. I just drew in this design. I had the general shape in mind before, so that was important. I also have some stoneware things for you to look at. This is another example of what I'm talking about in the tchotchke tray. It's just a little lip to hold things like earrings, rings, and whatnot, pins, little nails, whatever. But we also use them for soy sauce trays, which is pretty fun. I just put a little bit of slip, and then I added some clear glaze after it was bisque fired, and then I fired it again to cone 6. Okay, so I'm going to take this little pod of clay. It's just a little ball that I started to work on already, and I'm going to kind of not flatten it all the way with my fingers because I want to show you how to use cloth to separate the clay from a rolling pin. Remember, clay sticks to all surfaces, but most especially to non-porous surfaces such as plastic or glass. Wood, it can come back up after we've flattened it down. It won't stick too badly. But fabric is actually a great tool for you to use. I'm using a linen napkin, and I just put the clay on the napkin, and then I fold it so it's enveloped in it. If you've ever made pie crust, you might have done this sort of thing with some wax paper, parchment paper. And then you take your rolling pin and you just kind of roll it in multiple directions. You want to stretch the clay in multiple directions when you're using a rolling pin, because clay has some sort of molecular memory, which sounds funny to say, but it means that it will shrink in the direction it's stretched. So if you stretch it in multiple directions, it will not warp because it will shrink evenly. So that's why I'm turning it over and everything. I don't want it to be too thin. So here we are at, let me see, I have a handy dandy ruler. I might have to do it in centimeters. Nope, that was on that side. It's about a half a millimeter. No, centimeter. So I'm learning still. On the inches side, we're at about just over 1/8 of an inch, it looks like. We don't want it to be too thin because then it risks breaking in the drying process. But we don't want it to be thicker than 1/4 inch because then it will take too much moisture. Okay, so now that I've used this, I'm going to set it aside to clear my workspace. Now I could take this and just start pinching up the sides to make a nice lip if I wanted a rounder. We've got a little visitor. It's a tiny ant with something in its mouth. To make a little round pinch pot. So I'll just do that briefly to show you what I mean. Little dish pinch pot. I'm gonna just like pinch and turn. Clay is pretty plastic, so it's not like paper where I'd have to cut away some paper to make it, to make the walls go up. Occasionally, if you want a really deep thing and you're working with a flat piece of clay, you'll have to pizza cut out a piece, which I'll show you in a different demo. But for now, I'm going to flatten these again because I want to make a different shaped dish. I'm going to make a dish like this. And you'll have to wait for a while to see what it will look like. It's going to be a surprise. Okay, so my first step here is now I'm going to take the walls and I'm going to use one of my fingers as a brace. See, I'm bracing, and you can see that I'm pushing the edge up so that I get this little dish, little lip. It's not too deep because I make pretty shallow ones, just like a little plate with a little barrier to help whatever's sitting inside not roll away. I have lots of tiny things, so I have lots of tiny thing holders. Okay, so we're starting to get into a corner, which I will need to use another tool besides my finger, because my finger is a little too wide to help me with that, to keep down the edge. I'm using it as a brace. You see the circles? That's fine. I can totally get those out later. Okay, so you're like, what is that? I'm like, I don't know. It's the vague idea of what it's going to look like. We want to keep the bottom flat and the walls perpendicular. And for the ears, that's what these are. It's going to be some form of ear probably. So they don't need to be really walled. They're also really, really small. So doing the walls on that is pretty hard. So I'm just going to take a little bit of water. And the walls on these kind of pieces will not be uniform, like I showed you in the original pinch pot demo where I held the needle in place and turned the pot around so the walls were all the same length. This is a more organic kind of thing. If you're making an ornament, the walls don't need to be really that pronounced, but if you're making a little dish, they do. So again, nothing rolls out. If you want to put a little soy sauce in there, that's totally fine. It won't just spill all over the table or counter. Okay. So now that I have my basic shape here, I'm actually going to have to set it aside to dry, because my intention will be to do a very similar technique to this. This is called sgraffito technique. Sgraffito is the addition of a color and then scratching away the lines. I really like to use this color combo, which you can do in the reverse by using pale clay, so like a porcelain or white clay or a pale yellow clay. And then adding the electric brown, or there's a Cassius, which is a little bit darker than the electric brown when fired, on top. But then you have the reverse look, like white lines and dark paint, which is pretty cool for like a night scene. But in order to put this slip on top and have it stay there, I'm going to have to wait for the piece to dry a little bit more. So we're going to take a little break, and I just want to clarify that if I were to paint on my slip right now, I don't have my paintbrush with me, but I have a little paintbrush. If I were to try to put this slip that I have prepared on here, you can see it doesn't really stay that color. It starts to mix with the darker color. And that's because both clays are wet, and so they blend like a watercolor, which can be a fun effect, but you really want to get that stark difference so that your drawing can show up. So you want to wait a little bit before doing your drawing. And this time that you're waiting for this to dry, you might refer back to maybe a sketch that you've done. You can draw out what you want to have, or you can even print something off if you don't feel that your drawing skills are up to what you want your pottery skills to be. That's fine. So go ahead and do some research before you make your piece, but go ahead and put this aside and we'll wait for it to dry.